The moment you start explaining yourself under pressure, the power balance changes. Not because you're wrong, not because your reasoning is weak, but because needing to be understood lowers your leverage faster than being misunderstood ever could. Most people operate under the assumption that explanation equals maturity. Clear communication resolves misunderstandings. Transparency builds trust. Justifying your reasoning shows emotional intelligence and consideration for others. These beliefs feel correct because they align with values of openness and collaboration. But there's a gap between what explanation is supposed to accomplish and what it actually does to the structure of a relationship. The confusion comes from experiencing this gap repeatedly. You explain yourself clearly and thoroughly, yet the other person seems less convinced, not more. The dynamic feels different after the explanation, though you can't identify exactly how. The interaction was polite and reasonable, but something in the balance between you has shifted. You provided clarity, but instead of resolution, there's a subtle sense that you're now in a different position than when the conversation began. Leverage in interpersonal dynamics isn't about dominance or manipulation. It's about who is less emotionally dependent on being understood, approved of, or validated by the other person. Leverage correlates with emotional self-containment. The person who can remain internally steady while others experience confusion, frustration, or curiosity about their choices holds a different position in the interaction than the person who feels compelled to resolve that confusion. When you explain yourself in response to questioning, you reveal your emotional investment in the other person's understanding. This revelation shifts the balance of emotional dependency. The person asking the questions learns that they can create a response in you by expressing confusion or concern. You learn that their confusion or concern feels like something you need to address. The questioner's emotional state becomes a factor in your decision about how to respond. This mechanism operates through what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. Each time questioning produces explanation, the questioner receives confirmation that their emotional state has influence over your behavior. They don't need to understand this consciously for it to shape their future interactions with you. The pattern becomes encoded at a subconscious level, where their discomfort with your choices automatically triggers an expectation of clarification. Meanwhile, your nervous system learns to interpret their questioning as a signal that requires response. The physiological markers of this conditioning include increased heart rate when questioned, mental rehearsal of potential explanations, and a sense of incompleteness when interactions end without providing clarity. Your body begins to treat their confusion as your emergency, even when logic suggests otherwise. The psychological exposure created by explanation extends beyond the immediate interaction. When you provide detailed justification for your choices, you're essentially handing over the blueprint of your decision-making process. The other person gains insight into what factors influence you, what concerns motivate you, and what types of reasoning you find compelling. This information becomes leverage they can use in future interactions, often without conscious intent. This shift happens regardless of the content of your explanation. Even if your reasoning is flawless and your delivery is calm, the act of providing detailed justification signals that their approval or understanding matters to you. It demonstrates that you're willing to invest time and energy in managing their perception of your choices. The questioner doesn't have to argue for their right to question you or justify why their opinion should matter. By explaining, you've already granted them that authority. The predictability factor amplifies this dynamic exponentially. Once someone learns that questioning your decisions reliably produces detailed responses, they've discovered a method for accessing your attention and mental resources. This predictability transforms casual interactions into subtle power exchanges. The questioner learns they can generate focused engagement from you simply by expressing doubt or confusion about your choices. Your internal experience shifts as you become aware of this predictability. Decision-making begins to include anticipatory explanation. You find yourself mentally preparing justifications for choices before anyone has questioned them. The mere possibility of having to explain begins to influence the choices themselves. Options that would be difficult to justify become less appealing, even when they align with your actual preferences or judgment. The pattern becomes self-reinforcing because explanation creates predictability. When someone learns that questioning your decisions reliably produces detailed responses, They've discovered a way to engage your attention and energy. They don't need to be conscious of this dynamic for it to influence their behavior. The pattern teaches them that expressing confusion or concern about your choices is an effective way to receive your focused attention and detailed consideration. Social conditioning reinforces this pattern through cultural messages about communication and relationships. From childhood, most people learn that explaining yourself demonstrates respect, consideration, and emotional maturity. These messages create internal pressure to provide clarity when others express confusion. The failure to explain feels selfish or inconsiderate, even when the demand for explanation itself may be inappropriate. This conditioning operates through shame-based messaging that equates explanation with virtue and silence with selfishness. The person who doesn't explain their choices gets labeled as secretive, defensive, or inconsiderate. The person who provides detailed explanations gets praised for their transparency and communication skills. These social rewards and punishments train people to over-explain as a default response to questioning. Meanwhile, you learn to anticipate their questions and prepare your justifications. Your decision-making process begins to include consideration of how you'll explain your choices to them. You start evaluating options not just based on your own judgment, but based on how defensible they'll be under questioning. The mere possibility of having to explain begins to influence the choices themselves. Your autonomy becomes conditional on your ability to justify your decisions to someone else's satisfaction. The internal cost of becoming the designated explainer in relationships accumulates through several psychological mechanisms. First, there's the cognitive load of constantly preparing justifications for ordinary choices. Mental energy that could be directed toward creative thinking, problem solving, or personal growth gets redirected toward anticipating and addressing potential questions about your decisions. Second, there's the erosion of internal authority. When your choices consistently require external validation through explanation, your confidence in your own judgment begins to deteriorate. You start second-guessing decisions that would have felt natural and obvious before the pattern established itself. The need for explanation creates doubt about choices that don't actually warrant doubt. Third, there's the development of hypervigilance around other people's emotional states. You become attuned to signs of confusion, concern, or disapproval in others because these signals have become triggers for explanation. This hypervigilance is mentally exhausting and prevents you from being fully present in interactions because part of your attention is always monitoring for potential questioning. This dynamic appears across different types of relationships with variations in how it manifests. In romantic partnerships, one person might find themselves explaining their social choices, spending decisions, or time management to a partner who expresses concern or confusion. The explanations begin as consideration for the partner's feelings, but gradually become expected justifications for ordinary autonomy. The explaining partner believes they're being transparent and collaborative. The questioning partner might genuinely think they're just trying to understand. In family relationships, an adult child might explain their career choices, living situation, or lifestyle decisions to parents who express worry or disapproval. The explanations feel respectful, like honoring the family connection. But over time, the adult child remains in a position of seeking parental approval for adult decisions. The parents learn that their concerns carry weight in their child's decision-making process. The adult child learns that their choices aren't fully legitimate until they've been explained and understood. Workplace dynamics reveal this pattern with particular clarity. An employee might explain their methods, priorities, or time allocation to colleagues who question their approach. The explanations demonstrate professionalism and team collaboration. But when one person consistently explains their work choices to others who don't reciprocate, a hierarchy emerges. The explainer becomes accountable to the questioners. Their judgment becomes subject to ongoing peer review, even when they have formal authority. The cost of this pattern accumulates gradually rather than appearing as immediate conflict. Others learn that questioning your decisions produces detailed responses, so they question more frequently. You begin to overfunction socially, taking responsibility for other people's understanding and comfort with your choices. Your internal sense of authority over your own decisions erodes as you become accustomed to justifying them to others. The pressure to explain becomes a learned response that activates automatically when someone expresses confusion or concern. The psychological weight of constant explanation creates a form of decision fatigue that extends beyond the immediate choices being questioned. When every decision potentially requires justification, the mental energy required for decision making increases exponentially. Simple choices become complex because they must be evaluated not just for their practical merit, but for their defensibility under potential scrutiny. This erosion happens without confrontation or explicit power struggles. There are no arguments about respect or authority. The shift occurs through the accumulation of small interactions where one person consistently takes the role of questioner and the other consistently takes the role of explainer. The person receiving your explanations doesn't have to be manipulative for this dynamic to develop. They might genuinely appreciate your transparency and value your thoughtfulness. But appreciation and respect operate differently. Someone can appreciate your willingness to explain while simultaneously losing respect for your need to do so. Thoughtful people are particularly vulnerable to this pattern because they operate from assumptions that make explanation feel necessary and virtuous. They assume good faith in others' questioning. They believe that understanding leads to harmony. They prefer clarity to ambiguity and resolution to tension. When someone questions their choices, they focus on providing clarity rather than examining why clarity is being demanded. They prioritize the other person's understanding over their own autonomy. They choose harmony over boundaries. The failure of explanation isn't a communication failure, it's a structural failure. Explanation operates on the assumption that understanding leads to respect, but this assumption doesn't account for how the act of explaining itself affects the dynamic between people. When you explain yourself, you're not just conveying information. You're participating in a particular type of interaction with specific implications for status and authority. The content of your explanation might be perfect, but the context of explanation shapes how that content is received and what it communicates about your position in the relationship. The recognition of this pattern changes how interactions are interpreted. When explanation is no longer seen as neutral communication, it becomes visible as a structural element that shapes relationships over time. What once felt like clarity begins to register as evaluation. What once felt like openness begins to look like justification. The same behavior carries different meaning once the underlying dynamic is understood. Leverage is tied to emotional self-containment rather than communication skills or reasoning ability. The person who can remain internally steady while others experience confusion about their choices occupies a different position than the person who feels compelled to resolve that confusion. Not all tension requires resolution. Not all misunderstanding demands correction. Being misunderstood is not automatically a problem that needs solving. Sometimes the cost of providing understanding exceeds the value of being understood.